Hey guys, Stockaholics, thank you guys for being here today. The last oil tanker supercycle was from 2003 to 2008. During that time, we had the internet. So I wanted to go and see, I kind of wanted to hear what the media was saying during that time, what the average Joe and Jane kind of thought was going on in the world, what they were attributing that supercycle to. So I found this cool article today from the New York Times entitled "The Oil Tanker Shortages Add to the Price Squeeze," and this was written in 2004, so right, I guess, towards the middle of that cycle. So I'm going to read through this article today, and then as we go, I'm going to kind of share my thoughts and kind of point out a lot of the similarities to some of the things that we see today. Okay, with about 100 million of crude oil in its hold, the tanker Front Page will leave Kuwait in a few weeks, heading for Louisiana via the Suez Canal. When it arrives 30 days later, its 2 million barrels will feed refineries throughout the American Midwest with crude they will turn into heating oil for the winter. The trip will be expensive. ExxonMobil is paying Frontline, the ship's Norwegian owner, $6.95 million to make the journey. Last year, the price was $2.4 for a similar haul. The global oil demand surging and prices hitting record levels. The world's 1,500 oil tankers are all booked up and charter rates are soaring. The shortage of tankers is one sign of how strong demand and a lack of investment have left the oil industry's infrastructure stretched thin. That's one of the themes I hear a lot lately, is that the oil industry is probably underinvested in, especially when I've been hearing lately about refineries. There's a lot of talk around underinvestment in these refineries. These strange contribute to climbing energy costs for consumers. Estimates by the U.S. Energy Information Agency indicate the increase in oil transport costs this year translates into an extra 5 cents per a gallon or 1.3 cents per liter for gasoline at the pump. 5 years ago, when you were looking to book a ship in the Persian Gulf, you used to find 10 ships available, said Jeffrey Goetz of Poten and Partners, a broker in New York. Today, you find 3, sometimes only 1 or 2. That's what makes the market feel so tight. A year ago, we had a very oversupplied market with the medical event and low amounts of oil demand. Today, the oil tanker market is also much more tight. In part because of China's growing appetite for oil, the world is expected to consume 2.7 million more barrels a day this year than it did in 2003, and most of that is being transported by ship. The demand has contributed to a 73% jump in oil prices in the past year. I actually wanted to quickly show you guys this chart I found. This is the oil demand by year, and during that time, 2003 to 2008, you can see that this line, the demand, really rapidly went up during that time. Now, I believe this is largely because actually of the United States and demographics and money creation. During that time, we had the housing market on fire. And very similarly, you see that the 1970s, the rate of growth for oil demand was also very high. Seems like an odd coincidence to me. That was also when there was high dollar creation going on, something I found very interesting. And by the way, we have very high dollar creation going on today, and we also have a new demographic of millennials getting into their loan-aged years. Okay, going back to the article. There's a shortage of tankers today because basically everyone is screaming for oil. We haven't seen that narrative yet. We don't see that there's a lot of demand increases or anybody talking about that yet, but we know that the entire energy market is very tight, and I wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing that kind of narrative start popping up again soon. Okay, everyone is screaming for oil, said Bjorn Locken, a tanker broker at PF Bazo in Oslo. With ship owners finding it difficult to meet demand for the first time since 1973, tanker rates have more than doubled in recent weeks to a 30-year high. Rates on the largest ships, like those traveling between the Gulf and Japan, averaged $35,000 a day from 1995 to 2004, but have jumped to as much as $135,000 a day recently, according to Goetz. On a 40-day voyage, the difference adds up to $4 million. It's a good business to be in, said Tor Olav Troen, vice president of Frontline, the world's largest tanker owner. All the ships are being used today. In this market, we're making 5 million every day of net profit, even on Sundays. Oil prices partly reflect supply concerns stemming from the war in Iraq, which is something I've talked about before. The threats of strikes in oil-producing countries like Venezuela and Nigeria, and the fact that exporting countries like Saudi Arabia are already pumping nearly all the oil they can. These fears have added as much as 15 to the price of barrel, currently around 54. There's a lot of events in here that really mirror what's happening today. We've got a major oil producer in a war with Ukraine and Russia, much like when the United States invaded Iraq. That's kind of messed up the supply chain. Same deal was happening during this time. We've also seen all of these kinds of strikes in some other kinds of oil exporting nations too. There's a lot of civil unrest in certain places. And it just feels like that too. And lately we've seen Saudi Arabia, basically they're saying, hey, you guys were capped. We're going to do our best to increase production by another 1 million barrels a day by 2027. But we're probably pretty clearly tapped. Recently French the President Macron, he has that clip where he's basically whispering to Biden. He's saying, dude, they can't produce anymore. They're tapped. Same kind of things today. A lot of that reminds me of all of those kinds of events there. Eric Creel, an analyst with the Energy Information Agency, part of the U.S. Energy Department, suggests oil prices are also high because the basic infrastructure of oil supply simply cannot meet the growth in demand this year. It kind of reminds me of, I guess, of that narrative where we have that Keystone pipeline shut down, a lot of politics surrounding that thing where the politicians are getting blamed for the oil supply not being able to get where it needs to go because of similar things like that, right? It's not fear that's driving prices. It's the market fundamentals that everyone overlooked, Creel said. The tanker shortfall is just one of the pressures facing oil markets, a tightness that runs throughout the oil production chain, from fewer oil discoveries to a lack of refineries. So the fact that there was probably not a lot of oil discoveries going on during that time is because nobody was really looking, because the oil was in a tremendous, it was in a long-term bear market before that's finally started to turn, right? And then just like I mentioned in a recent video, high oil prices tends to lead to more people going looking for that stuff and then ultimately producing more of it, right? Okay, Paul Horsnell, who directs energy research at Barclays Capital in London, said the industry was paying the price for its lack of investment in the 90s. Everywhere you look, there's a shortage, Horsnell said. Low oil prices in the 80s and 90s after a glut of capacity from investments made in the 1970s resulted in few refineries, tanker terminals, and pipelines being constructed. For example, not a single new refinery was built in the United States in 3 decades, but at the same time, demand for oil has grown steadily. All of those things we hear pretty all over the place. It's just sounds very familiar to some of the things you hear today. There's been underinvestments in absolutely everything, Horsnell said. What we've got here is payback throughout the industry for a market that's relied too long on spare capacity. Major oil companies ordered hundreds of giant oil tankers in the 60s and early 70s after price shocks, and the closing of the Suez Canal sent ripples of concern through the West over the security of oil supplies. In the periods after this, in this 2003 to 2008 period, they also did much like they did in the 60s and 70s, and they ordered way too many oil tankers, probably thinking that rate of oil demand growth was going to continue, and it didn't, right? Okay. But then prices collapsed and the world economy went into a tailspin. For the industry, that meant there were too many ships and too little demand, said Morten Artson, president and chief executive of Overseas Shipholding Group, one of the world's top ship owners. Being a tanker owner in the 80s and 90s was an unattractive business. It took 2 decades to flush out that oversupply. Over the past decade, the number of tankers in operation has essentially been unchanged, with new ships slowly replacing older vessels that were scrapped. Also, because of two major oil spills in Europe in recent years, oil companies have come under pressure to require tankers to have double hulls, which are thought to be less prone to spills. New industry rules adopted by the International Maritime Organization in 2001 require ships built before 1982 to be taken out of service by next April, while single-hull ships must be scrapped by 2010. And all 40% of the existing fleet may go, and it seems unlikely that enough new ships can be built to replace them in time, some ship owners say. Today we have the similar kinds of regulations, instead not so much on the design for the hulls of the ship, but instead there's an increasing regulation surrounding carbon emissions and things like that. So a lot of ships, they're being forced to either alter their what goes into their vessel, things like scrubbers. They have other alternate fuel sources they're being kind of forced to have as well. So very similar concept. You see tightening environmental regulations, just like you saw during that time as well. Oil industry analysts, shipbrokers, and ship owners have all been caught by the global growth in oil demand, particularly from China, which alone has accounted for 40% of that growth in the past 4 years. One of the things you notice in any kind of commodity supercycle is that there's a kind of a new demand hub. I'm curious to see if that new demand hub is actually something weird this time, like Europe, where they're just doing their best to consume all kinds of energy in this energy crunch, right? China has been the big surprise, said Peter Evenson, executive vice president of TK Shipping. China became a net importer of oil in '93. Its consumption is set to increase 15% this year after jumping 11% last year, according to the IEA. Evanson said the strains were likely to continue for a while longer, as it takes about 4 years for a tanker to be delivered once it is ordered. Today, the time it takes to build a ship is somewhat lower than it was then, but we have all kinds of constraints too, because the shipbuilding industry is also really constrained, and right now they're just clogged with all of these container ship orders. So if you are to order a ship, it's very likely that we may actually see some similar times to actually get a vessel in the coming years. In the meantime, the existing fleet will remain busy after unloading at the Louisiana offshore oil port. The front page is already booked to load oil in West Africa and bring it to the United States. So hopefully you guys found that interesting. Let me know what you guys think. If there's any odd similarities you guys noticed too, I'd be curious to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments. Have a great day.